to wait for the microphone to come for you so that people can hear what the question is. And good evening. My name's Robbie Mochrie. I volunteer here at the Library of Mistakes. It's been my pleasure to put together this particular series. On Monday, we had Smith on inequality. Last night, we had Smith on wealth. It's particularly a pleasure to see people coming back repeatedly. So clearly, and it's also a pleasure, I'm not used to seeing the library just quite so full as this for events. It's good to meet people who are coming for the first time. It's good to meet old friends coming back. I've been asked to say just a few words about Smith and capitalism, just to orient the evening. Well, my simple version of this is that Adam Smith would not have understood capitalism. Not in the sense that he didn't think about the capital as being important. If you were here last night, you would realise that it was very important for him. But rather, what we call capitalism today was really a 19th century invention. Smith wrote about something called a commercial society, The Wealth of Nations, as was published in 1776. It was 1779 before James Watt, who Adam Smith knew well from his time in Glasgow, got the patents that would allow him to go on to become a millionaire from building steam engines. So at this time, the advanced technology was water wheels. The best way of getting from Glasgow to Edinburgh, which Smith did regularly, was still by stagecoach. That was a recent improvement. The canals were being built, but not complete. So when Smith talks about commercial societies, he's thinking about organisations in which, or countries in which business is all very small scale. You might remember hearing about Napoleon talking about Britain being a nation of shopkeepers. He didn't mean by that all we were doing was buying and selling, although that was very important for Britain. Instead, what he was thinking about was that Britain was a nation of workshops, of small businesses. And that's the kind of capitalism from the 18th century. So today we're going to think about some of the challenges of capitalism as it is now and for the future. I'm delighted that we've got people from many of Scotland's think tanks, and I'm going to hand over now to Susan Murray, who's the director of the David Hume Institute and who's going to chair this evening.
Thanks, Robbie, and good evening, everyone. As Robbie said, I'm Susan Murray. I'm director of the David Hume Institute, and I'm going to guide you through this evening. I'm afraid some of my introduction overlaps with Robbie, but just in case it didn't land the first time, I'm hoping it will the second. I'm delighted to welcome you all here this evening. This is the third event in the series marking the publishing of The Wealth of Nations. The previous two events have discussed inequality and wealth, and the speakers have examined how many people only understand very simplified misrepresentation of Adam Smith's writing. Indeed, a question was posed last night: if Adam Smith was alive today, would he sue the Adam Smith Institute for defamation? As Brian Cox, the actor, said when he was playing Adam Smith's ghost last year in the play, Make It Happen, "What do you mean you only read one book?" This play challenged the interpretation of Smith, claiming that selfishness drives society, by pointing out that many people ignore the theory of moral sentiment, where Smith argues that humans are deeply motivated by sympathy, moral judgment, and concern for others. Smith believed that markets work partly because people are embedded in moral communities. Social norms, reputation, and ethical judgment shape behaviour just as much as self-interest. Smith never described the system he analysed as capitalism. That term only became common later in the 19th century, as Robbie said. Instead, he analysed what he called the commercial society, a stage of economic development characterised by markets, division of labour, and private property. So tonight, we turn to three think tankers to ask what sort of capitalism will serve us well over the next 50 years, and what steps should be taken to achieve Smith's ideal of an opulent society. This is where the iPad, the future generation of tech, has now paused, and I haven't got your biographies scrolling up. Alison, do you want to introduce yourself? Yep. You're very wise.
I'm Alison Payne. I'm the research director at the think tank Enlighten, previously known as Reform Scotland, but you might appreciate we've changed our name recently. I'm really grateful to be here tonight and to be part of these discussions, and I'm really looking forward to the sort of panel discussion and the questions with the audience. But in terms of my opening remarks, I wanted to touch on a couple of issues that jumped out to me when I was thinking about where we are, looking to the election and where we want Scotland to go over the next 50 years. And issues that we've maybe lost sight of. Now, while I appreciate that Smith wrote at a time when a woman's place in society was very different, and I can understand the context of that time, it didn't stop the feminist in me getting, annoyed and the sort of the sexism of the time. But I changed my mind a little bit when this paragraph challenged that view. Smith wrote, "A man must always live by his work, and his wages must at least be sufficient to maintain him. They must even upon most occasions be somewhat more. Otherwise, it would be impossible for him to bring up a family, and the race of such workmen could not last beyond the first generation." Now, on the one hand, you could say that's, stereotypical male-dominated society of the time, but I took something else from it. Because Smith appears to recognise that there's value attached to women's traditional labour, particularly around care, childcare in this case. Indeed, women's work was necessary for the population to continue. Now, although women's work was not paid directly, it was recognised as having value and contributing to the good of the nation. Now, while a great deal has changed over the last 250 years, the undervalue and unpaid and underpaid work in traditionally female-dominated areas around this has potentially got worse, particularly in more recent years. Now, while I think a lot of what Smith says stands the test of time, I don't think society necessarily does. And our ideas and our outlooks can be the things that skew whether markets work. So, as we look to May's election and beyond, one of the biggest problems I see facing Scotland is in social care. Our NHS is in crisis and it cannot be fixed until we address social care. We have an ageing population who will increasingly need this vital service. And of course, it impacts on people's ability to be able to work, to maintain work and work more if they're also having to look after elderly relatives. Looking after some of the most vulnerable people in society is a skilled job. It is one that should take time and kindness. It cannot be easily viewed through the lens of increasing productivity. Care requires time. A carer charged with seeing twice as many people in the same amount of time could on one measure be deemed to be increasing productivity, but the care they deliver will be the poorer for it. Now, despite the importance of that role, we often pay carers a pittance. It's around about £13 an hour, the living wage, which they could earn in a far less stressful environment in a supermarket. Indeed, I find it scandalous that my son, who's still in school, can get a part-time job, low-skilled part-time job, and earn pretty much the same. Now, Smith notes, every man's interest would prompt him to seek the advantageous and to shun the disadvantageous employment. And he's right. Each of us here would make such decisions, but we expect people working in care to do otherwise. Now, for too long, we've relied on underpaid staff, often from overseas, to look after us when we need it most. Now, through immigration changes, the situation is becoming more acute, and the number of people willing to work in such circumstances is in decline. But those needing those services are increasing. Now, on paper, if the market was working properly, the increasing demand of service and the limited supply of staff should push up wages. But it doesn't, regardless of the provider. Instead, we see hospitals full of delayed discharges and families in crisis. And yet, when the polls talk of the most pressing issues ahead of the election, the NHS ranks high, but social care is often forgotten. Now, I don't see this as a failure of the markets, of supply and demand, or of institutions. Rather, it's a reflection on where we are as society and how we value work in traditionally female-dominated areas. Similar comments could be made around other jobs that were traditionally undertaken by women staying at home, including in childcare. Now, increasing women's participation in the workforce has undoubtedly been a good thing for women. It's been a fantastic thing for society, and it's been a really good thing for the economy. But we have undervalued those jobs that women were previously expected to undertake. And it's not just the fault of politicians. In 2017, thinking she was about to win a majority, Theresa May attempted to address the issue of social care and proposed new ways of paying for social care in her manifesto, and promptly lost her majority. Now, obviously, there was a number of other factors at play during that election that affected the Conservative result, but that result has subsequently impacted politicians' cautiousness of opening Pandora's box. Of course, the challenge of delivering social care are particularly more urgent in rural areas, where our demographic challenges are more sharper, the cost of delivering services is higher, access to affordable housing and good transport links are more limited. Locality, rurality and the importance of infrastructure are also addressed by Smith. He writes, "Good roads, canals and navigable rivers, by diminishing the expense of carriage, put the remote parts of the country more neatly upon a level with those in the neighbourhoods of the towns. They are upon that account the greatest of all improvements. They encourage the cultivation of the remote, which must always be the most extensive circle of the country." Now, while the circumstances and context of which he's written that changed, the importance of proving links between our rural and urban communities is just as relevant today. But again, it's not always top of the electoral priorities, whether it's the overpromised A9, the ferries fiasco, the fixation on providing free bus passes without actually ensuring that there's buses in many areas for people to access that travel. We've long failed to deliver the transformative infrastructure projects that Scotland needs, which would help attract the work, people to living in these areas and help grow the economy, as Smith envisaged. But this is again probably an area that where long-term economic and social sense to develop. It makes long-term economic and social sense to develop, but it doesn't deliver the short-term political wins. And that, to me, is the major stumbling block of where we are today. The fixation on doing what is politically expedient and the dominance of the political timetable means that long-term reform is often ignored. Now, reflecting on the politics, I considered ending my comments by highlighting this line, which feels very relevant today, particularly given what's going on in the Middle East, when Smith wrote, "The violence and injustice of the rulers of mankind is an ancient evil, for which, I am afraid, the nature of human affairs can scarce admit of a remedy." I felt that was slightly unfair on our Scottish politicians, and it was maybe a bit more of a downbeat note to end. So I've got another quote. "No more dreaming about tomorrow." Now, the astute of you, or those that are of a similar vintage to me, will know that that is not a quote from The Wealth of Nations. Rather, it is a quote from the Kylie and Jason hit, Especially for You. Now, those of you who saw the brilliant Make It Happen that Susan mentioned last year in the Festival Theatre will be aware that Adam Smith and Fred Goodwin sing Especially for You in karaoke during the play. Now, as a child of the late 80s who had her walls covered in posters of Jason and Kylie and then went on to study economics at Edinburgh University, it brought both parts of those worlds nicely together for me. But I think it is also a message for politicians in the next Scottish Parliament. Our economy can't grow without a thriving private sector, but it can't achieve that goal if we don't have a skilled workforce, if we don't have the health and longevity of our workforce, good infrastructure to enable the growth across the country. Addressing these issues requires long-term sustainable reform. There is no point dreaming about a better tomorrow unless we start making the changes necessary to make it happen today.
Thank you, Alison. I've now found your bio. Do you still want me to read it? Because you didn't really introduce yourself with great detail, and I feel I should do it for everyone equally. So, as you said, the feminist in you feels you should. The feminist in me says, yes, I can't introduce the boys and not introduce you properly. So we'll do it in reverse order, if that's all right. So Alison is the Research Director of Enlighten, formerly known as Reform Scotland. She's a graduate of the University of Edinburgh and joined Enlighten in 2008, just as the financial crisis happened. Immediate prior to this, she was head of research for the Scottish Conservatives and a political advisor to the party leader Annabel Goldie. She has spent 10 years volunteering as a Girl Guide leader and is also area coordinator for the charity Widowed and Young. Next to Alison is Laurie McFarlane. Oh, it's stalled again, this blinking technology. Wonder what Adam Smith would think of this. Laurie McFarlane. He is a fellow of UCL, the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose. He is also a council member of the Progressive Economy Forum and co-author of a book, Rethinking Economics of Land and Housing. And he's currently co-director of the Future Economy Scotland think tank. Over to you, Laurie.
Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for inviting me along today. It's a real great honour to be part of the discussion. So, similarly, I actually want to start by discussing some of the key insights of Smith, which I think are some of the most important, but which, to some extent, I feel like we have overlooked over the course of the many centuries since Smith was around. Both which have impacts in terms of economics as a subject, but also in terms of the functioning of contemporary capitalism more broadly. And so today when we talk about Adam Smith, we think of him as the father of economics as a subject. But Smith himself wouldn't have regarded himself in that way, mainly because economics as a field didn't exist formally in the 18th century. Smith was, of course, a moral philosopher first and foremost. And for him, how the economy operates and in whose interest wasn't a kind of morally neutral or just a purely technical or scientific endeavour. The question of who gets what and why and how we organise production, distribution and consumption was inherently bound up with moral and ethical judgments. And it was also unavoidably political for that reason. And that's why economics was originally called political economy before that part of the term got dropped. And while economics emerged out of moral philosophy, I think for me the subject's become increasingly unmoored from those ethical foundations. And I think this really began in the early 20th century with the establishment of what's now called neoclassical economics, when economists tried to transform the discipline away from that political economy approach into something more akin to a hard natural science. And they got what some have described as physics envy and wanted to kind of replicate the ability to model things out with mathematical precision according to hard laws that you get in physics. And so in doing so, they built increasingly complex mathematical models of markets and the economy, often based on extremely simplified and, in my view, highly unrealistic assumptions. And the aim was really to create what sometimes referred to as a value-free science, a kind of technical discipline that could describe the economy objectively, free from the kind of politics and morality that Smith would have encountered. And when people study economics today at university, like I did, it's often this kind of neoclassical framework that they encounter. I think in reality, though, this kind of economics is far from value-free. It rests on a whole bunch of ideological assumptions which are kind of baked in and hidden around the nature of human welfare, around the ownership and governance of firms, around the role of the state and markets, but it also ignores really important real-world factors which are key to the economy, things like different aspects of human behaviour, of institutions, of law, of culture, which are crucial but are quite hard to kind of map out mathematically. And so for me, I think in the modern age, too much of what we describe as economics is kind of ideology masquerading as science. And this isn't just a purely theoretical problem, it has huge real-world consequences. Because when we look around the world today, economists are often put on a kind of pedestal above other social scientists. What they say is kind of given more weight than others. And the discipline's played a hugely influential role in shaping contemporary capitalism and has done over the past 5-6 decades. And so when we look at the economy today, though, we can see outcomes which kind of at best are morally dubious, but at worst are a moral outrage. We tolerate grotesque levels of inequality, both within countries like the UK, but also globally between countries as well, where some individuals are able to amass hundreds of billions of pounds in wealth, while others can't get a roof over their head and feed their families. And the idea that we should be concerned with inequality in any way, believe it or not, is actually, until relatively recently, was quite a heretical idea within economics. And thankfully that's changed, particularly since the financial crisis. And behind the causes of that soaring inequality, I think, is another key insight of Smith's, which I do think has also been somewhat sidelined. Because although Smith is known for The Wealth of Nations, he made a really important distinction between two things, between, on the one hand, true wealth creation, which results from productive activity and combining the factors of production and creating value, but he contrasted that to what we could call today wealth extraction. And wealth extraction relates to zero-sum activity, where one person is able to enrich themselves directly at the expense of others. So it's not about growing the pie, it's about getting a bigger slice of the pie for yourself. And this is, the most common way of this is by owning and controlling scarce assets and resources and being able to charge others for access to it. And for Smith, but also other founders of political economy, John Stuart Mill, David Ricardo, this distinction was really, really important. And the ability to extract wealth from others in this way was referred to as economic rents. And this was generally viewed to be unearned income. Now, in Smith's time, he was particularly thinking about landowners and landlords, but also other types of monopolies. And landowners are able to, at that time, large landowners able to enrich themselves by charging higher and higher rents, earning more money without necessarily contributing productively to the process or anything around it. And Smith and others believed that limiting this kind of rent-seeking behaviour was really, really important, not just because about issues of fairness, but actually about issues of efficiency and in terms of making sure that the economy was functioning in a way that is efficient, whereas excessive rent-seeking that we see in the economy today in various ways can undermine that. Because if we look around the economy and thinking specifically about Britain's economy today, but also more broadly, we see that various types of rent extraction has become pretty endemic. We see very large amounts of wealth being accumulated, not through the kind of textbook process of wealth creation, but by simply owning and controlling scarce assets and platforms and extracting those kinds of economic rents. Now, perhaps the most visible way we see this is in the housing market, which has been the primary driver of wealth accumulation in this country over recent decades. In fact, around 2/3 of all household wealth that's been accumulated since the mid-1990s has come from simply house prices rising. Now, we often hear in the media this is seen as a kind of thing to celebrate. Oh, house prices are going up, that's great, and it's one of the only things that we do that with. But this has a corresponding cost, and that cost is borne by those who don't own property either now or in the future, where when housing becomes more expensive, it means seeing more of their incomes eaten up through higher rents or having to save up more for a mortgage and taking out ever larger mortgages with ever higher interest rates. And so in some senses, in my view, the housing boom that we've seen over the course of the past 3 decades or so, it's not wealth creation, it's the largest redistribution of wealth, I think, that we've ever seen, away from those who don't own property towards those who do. But we also see similar extractive dynamics in parts of the financial system, where complex financial instruments and predatory behaviour often extracts value rather than creates it. And we see it increasingly in modern tech platforms, where what are in some cases quasi-monopolies are able to extract rents through network effects. And we still see it to a very large degree through the ownership of natural resources, from land to oil to rare earth metals and others. And in a world of such dizzying technological progress, it is, when you think about it, quite strange that some of life's most basic essentials, whether that's energy or whether that's housing, has become so eye-wateringly expensive. And I think part of the reason for this is because we've allowed certain things like housing and energy and others to become vehicles for this kind of rent extraction that Smith warned about, where one person's gain is another's pain. And with the acceleration of AI and automation that we're seeing at the moment, I think there's a real risk that these dynamics are put on steroids over the coming years. And if we're not careful, we could be moving towards a world where millions of people are put on the scrap heap or left out of work, while enormous amounts of wealth is ever more concentrated in the hands of the few tech oligarchs who own and control the key infrastructure and platforms. And were Smith around today, I think he would be concerned about this, although of course we'll never know. And then we have the other great challenge of our time, which is escalating environmental breakdown. When we look at the roots of this crisis, it is really down to our economic system is plundering the planet, burning through the resources at a far greater rate than Earth is able to replace them. And the evidence is clear that we've reached far beyond safe planetary boundaries that are starting to threaten the life support systems that underpin human civilization, both now and in the future. So none of this is natural or inevitable. It is the result of this economic system that is producing these immoral outcomes almost by design, whether that's in relation to the distributional problems or whether it's in relation to the environmental ones. And as this system has been designed by humans, it can be redesigned to serve different ends. But if we're to do this, we can't just treat economics as a supposed value-free, morally neutral subject. We really need to ask explicitly normative questions around what kind of society do we want? What represents a fair and just distribution of resources? And what obligations do we have, both to each other, both to the planet, but also to future generations? So in other words, I think if we're to do this, we need to bring questions of ethics back into the centre of economics and policy. And at Future Economy Scotland, which is the organisation I'm co-director of, we believe in an economic system that's democratic, sustainable and just. And this means that in a world of such abundance, everyone's basic needs are met. A society that's not perfectly equal, but where everyone has the opportunity to fulfil their real potential. An economy where people live with dignity and security from cradle through to the grave. And an economy where technological progress is harnessed to serve the common good, not just the private profit of an increasingly small number of people. And of course, fundamentally, an economy that operates within sustainable ecological limits, preserving the planet and our resources for future generations. And I think moving towards this kind of vision requires us to open up some really fundamental questions that I think mainstream economics has tried quite hard to make us ignore. So questions about who owns the economy and how different parts of it are structured and organised. Questions about how firms are structured and governed and who has a say in the decision making within these firms. Questions about the role of the state and markets. And questions about which parts of our economy should remain in the marketplace and which should be taken out and provided as universal public goods like we do with the NHS, which in my view would include care that we just heard about. So just to wrap up, 250 years ago, Adam Smith informed us that we can't separate economics from moral and ethical judgments. And I think for me, the most fitting way to mark the 250th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations is to try and rediscover that and bring it into the discussion in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. And next up, we have Stephen Boyd. Last but not least, he's Director of IPPR Scotland. Stephen brings more than 2 decades of experience working in Scottish economic and policy for the think tank IPPR Scotland. Prior to this, he worked for the Scottish Government in economic and labour market policy, and he's also worked in industrial policy with the Scottish Trade Union Congress. Over to Stephen.
Okay, thanks, Susan. I'm going to take a slightly different tack, I think, from my panel members here and focus quite tightly on the question that Susan raised at the start, which is what sort of capitalism will serve us well over the next 50 years so that we can achieve Smith's ideal of an opulent society. An impossibly large question, I think, to cover in the 5 minutes that I've promised Susan that I will stick to. But yeah, we can maybe make a start. So I think in trying to answer this question, we can safely assume 2 things. By opulent society, Smith meant a society in which prosperity, both material and spiritual, was broadly shared. In his famous quote, he said, "No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of members are poor and miserable." I think we can also safely assume that Smith would envisage that the market would play some kind of role, and I think during discussion we might want to talk about the limits of the role, the limits of the role that markets play in delivering this society. But I would also argue the kind of capitalism, at risk of repeating quite a lot of what Laurie said here, but the kind of capitalism that prevails in the UK and Scotland in 2026 is not a kind of capitalism that's particularly well played to deliver that opulent society. We've seen it deliver persistent, embedded, high inequalities of income and wealth. We've seen prolonged periods of stagnant productivity growth and concomitantly low growth in living standards and incomes over the last few decades. And is this a kind of capitalism that can really rise to meet the challenges, the key challenges of distribution, environmental change, demographic transition and technological transition over coming decades? I don't think it is, but we should also remember that there are, to coin a phrase, varieties of capitalism. The model that prevails here is one particular kind. I would argue that in other countries, particularly in Northern and Western Europe, there are models of capitalism that differ quite significantly from the UK and which also are much better placed to meet the challenges of the 21st century. So, what do these societies manage to achieve much more broadly based prosperity. They are both wealthier and fairer and more equal than the UK, and have maintained that performance over time. And they managed to reconcile some of the world's largest welfare states with some of the world's most dynamic, innovative and productive economies. And again, they've done that over the longer term. So what can we learn from these societies? What do they do that's different from us? Well, I would argue, particularly in the Nordics, but I think the same is also true of the Benelux countries, to a lesser extent to Germany and Austria. But certainly for the Nordics, what do they do that's different from us? Well, they managed to achieve a much more even balance of power between labour and capital, and I think this is really fundamental. How did they manage to do that? They have much stronger trade unions, much broader trade union decentry, much broader collective bargaining coverage. They've got a range of both formal and informal institutions of what I would describe as social partnership. So forums in which government, labour and capital, the peak associations of which can come together and try to find solutions to society's great problems. And again, they've managed to sustain that over a long period. Relatedly, they're much better at consensus building, and something I would argue in Scotland we're particularly poor at. We should be able to achieve some measure of consensus around about economic development. I think in the early years of devolution we got quite close there. I think that has kind of disintegrated since the global financial crisis, and I just don't think we have the institutional framework in Scotland that allows us to kind of develop those broadly based solutions to the great challenges we face. I think you look at ownership and control, something Laurie mentioned, but ownership and control in these countries, it looks very different from the models that prevail here at this moment in time. So yes, there is greater prevalence of both public and cooperative ownership, but really crucially, private firms are owned and managed and governed in very different ways from UK firms. So a few weeks ago I was kind of messing about with ChatGPT at the weekend and looking at by country, the 10 largest firms by market capitalisation in a range of countries. So you look at Denmark, the market cap, the 10 biggest firms, around about £700 billion. So Novo Nordisk is about half of that. But you've also got Maersk, Carlsberg in there. And what's different about these firms? They're foundation owned. So 6 of the top 10 firms in Denmark are foundation owned. So that means that they are properly Danish owned. I mean, all the A-class voting shares in Novo Nordisk are owned by that foundation. They can invest for the longer term, and they also distribute all manner of benefits throughout the country through the foundations that are attached to them, cultural spending, etc. So you're owned and managed very differently from our firms. I think the composition of social spending in these countries also looks quite different to us. So they invest much more in areas that complement employment, so particularly childcare and active labour market policy, which means their labour markets function much more efficiently than us, but are also much fairer and provide much better opportunities than ours do as well. And I think ultimately there's a recognition that social spending and economic development can be mutually reinforcing in these countries, a lesson I think that we've long since forgotten. And I think all these the different characteristics of these countries kind of add up to just a greater legitimacy for the capitalist models that they operate. And I think that's something that should really concern us at the moment when we're going through not just something like a crisis of capitalism in the UK in 2026, but certainly some kind of crisis of liberal democracy as well. And I think Smith would have been absolutely fascinated by, as other thinkers since, particularly I think Polanyi, looking at the relationship between government and the private sector over this period of time. I think he would have been fascinated at how things have developed. And I think he would worry at this moment in time that when we face that crisis of legitimacy across both the market and government and liberal democracy, I think he would be looking for a model that helped embed both for the future in a way that helps to create that opulent society that he referred to. Just leave it there.
Fantastic. There's so much in what each of you have brought to the table there. I know there's a lot of expertise in the room, and I want to leave plenty of time to draw out on that. And before I come to you for questions, I will say yesterday and the night before there was a flurry of questions at the end, and we couldn't get through them all. So please do get your hands up quick, and particularly the ladies in the room, because there were a lot more ladies wanting to ask questions at the end when we ran out of time than there were at the beginning. So I urge you to not be shy in putting your hands up. I want to come to something Laurie brought out, I think, because it's the thing that jumps out at me most about economics, which is when I was at school, the people that did economics were the ones that were good at maths. And I was always under the impression that economics was a kind of definite science. There was a right or a wrong answer. And as I got older, the more it became really clear that economics had loads of assumptions in, but actually the number of people that were studying it was quite narrow. So a lot of the assumptions they were making were the same assumptions, and they weren't really challenging each other. And there was a report out this week about public services in Scotland, a really interesting analysis, all about numbers, lots and lots and lots about numbers, absolutely nothing about the distribution of the population in Scotland. So essentially, if you take the report to its end, it would be much more efficient to move everyone in Scotland to the central belt, and you could provide cheaper public services. Or it would be even cheaper to move everyone to the southeast of England. I don't think that's what they were advocating. But if you don't mention something that's so glaringly obvious when you're talking about economics, it really, really matters. And I think that came through in each element of what you were saying, in that we really need to think really hard around the questions. And when someone's saying, this is the answer, have they really asked all the questions that are involved? And I think that's what I love about Adam Smith, is he thought really deeply about so many things that were interconnected and complex, and there weren't easy answers. And I think that's what's ahead of us, and each of you brought out. Something you brought up, Alison, connects to something that was discussed last night, particularly at the end after the formal questions. And it was the connection between some of the changes in social care in Scotland, and there's been a big move of private equity investment into care homes, and it's really changing the dynamic and the economics of that sector. I can see you nodding, Laurie. Do you want to say anything on that? Is that something you've been looking at, or Alison?
Can I just come up with that? Mm-hmm. I think part of the problem in social care is not restricted to whether it's a private sector owner or a public sector. I think we Enlightened did some work on this recently, and polling, and the public generally do not understand how social care is funded.
Yeah, no, that's not what the issue was being raised.
I know, but that sort of thing, in terms of there is an idea that people aren't getting paid much because people are the private sector are creaming off the money. And I think because of the contracts that local authorities are offering and how that money is a lot of the problems, yes, there is the private equity element, but a lot of the problems in social care are down to the fact that it's the contracts between the providers and the local authorities. I think it's a simple and easy answer to blame private equity, whereas a lot of the problems in terms of, there was a recent issue in terms of a lot of the care providers had to fight through the Parliament to get additional money to ensure that the local authorities were able to pay the living wage to the private equity firms that are running the care homes. But I think the idea that it's simply the problems in social care are down to the fact that private equity is involved. There are a number of problems, but it isn't simply a case of it's not run by the state, because state-run care homes are having just as many problems.
Yeah, no, that wasn't what they were raising. Never mind, I'll take it in a different direction. Laurie, you were nodding. Do you want to say anything?
Well, I was just I need to turn this on.
No, I think it's on automatically.
No.
Yeah, it was just really coming back to the point I was saying earlier on about we need to have a discussion about what should be sort of run in the sort of private sector marketplace, and where the line is drawn between that and things provided universally as a universal service. And I think care, both in terms of the old age care but also childcare, speaking as someone who's had two children in the last 2 years, it's very clear that both are broken. And I think having them both provided as a universal service, in other words, decommodified, is a win-win-win across the board. And on the childcare front, both in terms of the people, I mean, in our case, before you get the free childcare, it's nearly £15,000 a year to have someone in nursery. Similarly, in old age. That's a huge sum. It's putting people off actually having children. It's also putting people off putting women in particular back into going into the labour market and things like that. And so I think, like, in both cases, this sort of fractured system, and for me, I think private equity is just not, like, having our old age care in the hands of private equity just seems to be so far from optimal. And I appreciate in the state-run element of this, of course, there are issues as well. And it's not a simple case of just handing over one from another. It's a complete systems overhaul, I think, from top to bottom, in terms of how these sectors are run, how they're owned, how they're operated, how we support staff and workers in these sectors. So yeah, I agree it's definitely not an individual case of just switching sort of ownership in one case, but I do think in both areas, in children and old age, I think fundamentally changing the system to have a universal service of provision just is a win-win-win, basically. Clearly, it's a lot of work, it will involve money, but I think the benefits that would be generated from that long term would be well worth it.
Stephen?
Yeah, but I think there's a deeper, broader question here, I think, about our inability, I think, as a society to get to grips with the fact that a never-rising share of our economy is in people-driven services, you know, in which the rate of productivity growth is intrinsically slow because it's just difficult to automate that human labour, and therefore the costs of delivering those services will always rise at a rate above the whole economy rate of inflation. And you can see that in this one. I mean, I agree with 75% of Laurie's analysis about where economics goes wrong. I think there's 20% that's kind of really useful. And, you know, the work of William Baumol 50 years ago absolutely predicted this. You know, he would say that the costs of delivering these kind of services, also true for similar services, mainly delivered by the private sector. Hairdressing being the classic example. But, you know, Baumol argued at that time, you will see these rises, the cost of delivering these services continue to rise year upon year. You will see these services account for a greater proportion of employment. You will see them account for a greater proportion of output, and you've seen this in all countries at all times. But we as a society, and certainly our political parties, always like to think they are going to deliver the clever idea that brings down the cost of reducing the cost of delivering these services. They never do, because it's impossible until you find a way of replacing the caregiving services with technology. You know, personally, I hope that never happens, and it'd be nice to hear people say that it's never going to happen. But until you find a way of automating these services, the cost of delivering will rise at a rate above the whole economy rate of inflation. And we as a society need to get to grips with that. If we're talking about what capitalism looks like over the next 50 years, essentially I was reading a paper earlier on from about 10 years ago, Wendy Carlin and Samuel Bowles. I'm not quite sure if you have them in the mainstream or the heterodoxy, but they argued that capitalism was on a trajectory of shrinking because it was unable to provide those kind of services through the market. I think they were probably broadly correct, but that then raises really fundamental questions about the shape of the economy and how we pay for these services in the future.
Fantastic. That's a good place to come to the audience, I think. So I'm going to move amongst you with the microphone. So I can see a hand up straight away. So I'll hand the microphone around, but just signal to me in between so I get the microphone quickly.
Just to start, I am an accounting person, so this will be good to sort of get an economic insight on this. So the thing that interests me, and you've all kind of picked up on it, which kind of prompted the question, is you're talking about kind of the crisis of capitalism and where it's going to be in 50 years. And I'm thinking sort of particularly, and you think in the wake of AI, and if we imagine a worst case scenario, do you think in 50 years it's going to be capitalism, or does it need to evolve into something else to support the direction things are going? If, for example, AI makes most jobs redundant, for example, do you think capitalism can essentially survive the next 50, 100 years?
Who wants to start?
I can maybe kick off. So I think with AI, there's kind of two extremes, you could say. There's those who are sort of saying all jobs are going to be made redundant imminently, and you had the head of Microsoft's AI division say recently that all accountants and lawyers are going to be redundant within 18 months. So a kind of complete bloodbath type scenario. And then there's those who say actually technology has always made jobs redundant, and we always have new jobs emerge elsewhere. And I kind of find myself in the middle somewhere. I do think AI is different, certainly from what we've had before. It's not just replacing sort of manual labour, it's replacing all kinds of things, intellectual labour, and actually I think it could be extremely disruptive. But I think we need to get to grips with the reality, which it may be the case that there may be less work to go around. But I think that is not a bad thing at all. That could actually be a very good thing. as long as we accompany that by major reconfiguration of our economy. Because if we just let this run, as I said in my talk, there is a scenario where actually we do see a lot of jobs made redundant quite quickly. We see people thrown on the scrap heap, no jobs becoming available, or at least ones that are well paid. And we see this turbocharging inequality that we see. But actually, less work to go around, well, let's societally decide to work less. And we're a 4-day week organisation. We really believe in shortening the working week. We fought very, very hard for the weekend. That wasn't handed by the government and corporations. That was fought and won for by the labour movement. I don't understand why we stopped at 2 days and thought job done. So let's extend it for a beginning to the 3-day weekend, 4-day week. And the benefits of that enormous for a better work-life balance, enabling people to focus on things that matter, family, health, well-being, other things, and to gradually move in a situation where we're actually working less, but always making sure that people can afford to do it. And the key to that is ensuring that the productivity gains from AI and other technology aren't just hoovered up by the very, very top few, but are redistributed to an extent. And whether that's in the form of a universal basic income or whether that's in the form of something similar but slightly different, I think that's up for debate. But I think thinking about how we socialise at least a proportion of the huge productivity gains were they to emerge, to redistribute across society, and to think about how we share progress not just in the form of higher wages but less work. So I think there's an opportunity as well as a risk here, and I think repoliticising working time is something that I think is really important and something that we're trying to think about how we do that a bit more.
Thanks. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, no, I was just going to, on the back of that, I think there are changes, and AI is certainly coming. I think it also, we need to start adapting now and look at things, what we do in terms of skills and lifelong learning. The idea of a job for life, we've been saying for 30 years there's no such thing as a job for life, but we've not actually done anything about looking at what we do about retraining and what we do about the skills. And there are things that we need to be focusing in on there. That I think that how we think about work and where the work opportunities are changing. And so we need to adapt. And I think that there are priorities and things that we need to do there. But I think capitalism will also adapt, because whatever we do, we're in a global economy now, way more so than when Smith was around. And there are things that we will do, but who knows what's going to be happening, particularly if you end up with Trump Mark II and all the rest of it. We're still working in that environment.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to say that technology and just unemployment is not something that worries me at the moment. I mean, I worry about an awful lot about the current state of the economy. I don't worry about that. I mean, I always think of the Cory Doctorow line that, AI definitely can't do your job, but an AI salesman can definitely convince your boss that AI can do your job. And I kind of think that's the paradigm we're in at the moment. I published a blog a couple of weeks ago with Cindy Chu, who's a radiologist at Glasgow University, and we were kind of discussing the fact that 10 years ago James Hinton was one of the kind of great fathers of AI, argued that at that point, stop training radiologists, AI can already do the job better than they can. Well, of course that was never true, because AI modelers didn't understand what radiologists did, so got good at image recognition. That's only part of a radiologist's job. And actually you wind forward 10 years, there's a shortage of radiologists in all advanced countries. It's currently the best paid medical subsector in the United States. Yes, at the margin, it kind of automated parts of that job, but that reduced the cost of delivering that job, and therefore it's the Jevons paradox, call it in economics, demand for that service then rises. So although I think AI can be massively disruptive in many ways that should worry us, and you can already see that, every time you switch on social media, I don't worry too much about the unemployment side. But I mean, the kind of second part of your question, or the kind of main part of your question about can capitalism survive the next 50 years? I mean, again, I think that's really tightly linked to can liberal democracy survive 50 years, So what have we got in as America slides towards a kind of authoritarianism, how would you describe America's market economy at this moment in time? It's not the vision of capitalism that kind of business people in America generally promoted 50 years ago, is it? But it's kind of a weird kind of corporatism we have at the moment. So I worry about both surviving the next 50 years, and I think they're really tightly related to each other.
Hello, and thank you very much for 3 very interesting presentations. I suppose my question is, you've talked lots about different parts of systems. The NHS, healthcare, the economy, they're all parts of different systems. But to actually look at the system itself and what is wrong with the system, because the system defines the outcome. And there's a really good saying by Edward Deming, put a good man into a bad system and the system will win every time. And I don't know if you've come across Meg Wheatley. She's an American Scot. She comes over here quite a lot to talk about models of change. And she has this model, the two-loop model. And she believes quite firmly, and I've looked at many models of change, and I was involved in ULAB when the Scottish Government was involved in that. And I have to say, at the end of the day, I didn't think much of it. But what Meg Wheatley says is you have to change a system by creating a new system out with the old. You cannot keep tweaking and making piecemeal changes. So what is the fundamental, I think it was Lawrence, you talked about what is the root? What is the root of the system that actually drives the outcomes? And I want to know, it's all great to know the problems, I think we all know them anyway, but I want to know how. How would Adam Smith manage today? How are we going to track the root? And I think there is somebody in the audience who has some thoughts on this, about what is the root of the system, and everybody's skirting around it and just talking about pieces. And maybe you could talk about how you're going to identify, and there's a common root to all three of your talks, but how are you going to identify that and change it? And how are you going to build a new system? You know, it's a long question, it's complicated, but...
Thanks, Alison. I can see your hand up.
Yeah, I think part of it, I think, is politics. We can't get separated from the sort of the political, because we can't change a system. You need political leadership to get the change through. I don't think that the outside...
If you do it outside the system, that was my point. If you do it outside the system, you don't need the politics.
I think, though, if you think about things that we've failed to do collectively for the last 30 years in terms of devolving power down middle of the Scottish Parliament to enhance our communities, or to look at things like the council tax reform and other systems, that there's been lots of, we've had sort of civil assemblies and things looking at things. Nothing's changed. There does need to be an element of political leadership, I believe, to get things through. I think that I do think, though, this election is offering an opportunity. I think the status quo has failed, and has failed miserably in recent years, where we are running out of money. Our demographics are a huge problem, and I think actually the fact that we are getting to a critical point will ensure that we have to do something differently, because we can't carry on the path that we are. I think once we get this election out of the way, I think there is an opportunity that we will have to see better cross-party working. I think at the moment, we're this close to election, nobody wants to work across the piece, but what we have seen, and some interesting things have happened in Wales, where they've managed to deliver difficult reforms, where the parties have worked together and come together and accepted, look, if you want to get things done, there has to be that kind of, we have to take a step back from the party politicking. And I think the way that our media operates, the way that social media operates, the way that a lot of conversation out with the Scottish Parliament is, it falls down party lines. And I think that there is an opportunity post-election to try and drive change. It can be driven from the outside, but I think we need to work with our political systems. I don't think it can happen without the politics.
I'll just give you one bit of feedback. The politicians and the government are the system.
But it's the system we have.
Did you want to change it?
Stephen, were you looking to come in?
I will try. I mean, I
Okay.
think it's...
I'm just going to say, I've got a load of questions stacked up. So either you need to answer shorter, or I'm only going to allow one of you to answer one question. So I'll give you a couple of quick sentences.
I'll make a very short contribution to that. I mean, last year it was the 25th anniversary of the Scottish Parliament. I was doing some reading about looking back to 1999 and the kind of aspirations people had for the Parliament. And one of the big aspirations, looking beyond the political process, was anticipated that there would be a flourish in a Scottish civic society, and they would be heavily engaged with each other and with the Parliament system. That's not really happened, and I can't give you a very good answer why that's not happening, but I think if we're going to look for an effective solution to the problem you've identified, it has to be bottom up and it has to come through civic society. And I think the different components of civic society, kind of environmental movement, the poverty NGOs, the trade unions, have to get better at speaking to each other again. I know there is some kind of Laurie's involved, all these groups myself, but particularly I look at the debates I'm involved in around about the economy, and then I'm involved in discussions about poverty alleviation, etc. Really does the twain meet, and it should do. Yeah, I think it has to be bottom up, and it has to, Scottish Civic Society has to get a grip.
Laurie, you all right if I go to the next question?
Thanks. First of all, I fully agree in the comments on social care. If we don't sort social care, we can't sort the health service, and both of these should be non-party political. That everybody should get together on that. In terms of the lack of affordable supply of housing and energy, the problem is a regulated environment that doesn't allow the market to function properly. And one of the reasons that politicians want to have control of every aspect of our lives is the alleged environmental crisis, which is the biggest myth of the 21st century. But it would take me a long time to explain that to people who have been basically brought up with the climate change propaganda that the UN has produced.
As there's a comment, I'll just go to the next question.
Thank you. We heard Laurie criticising the use of economic models in terms of the lack of challenge to assumptions and the lack of context. What I missed was the behavior of economic actors. Last century, the economist Frank Wright said that if we look at the throwing of a ball, for example, we can measure force that leads to speed. But if we look at economic actors, we can measure actions, but we can't measure what leads to the action, which is consciousness and motivation. And one thing I would like to urge everybody is to look at the work of Dr. Patrick Schotenus, who worked with Didasco at the charity behind the Library of Mistakes, who wrote a book called The Market Mind Hypothesis, building on the work of Adam Smith, among others, which is very interesting in this context. What I would like to ask the panel is, working for a think tank, how do you deal with this criticism of models? How do you build them differently, perhaps, and how do you use them differently?
Great question. Laurie, as you didn't get a chance to answer the last one, do you want to start on this one?
Yeah, really, really good question. So I suppose the first thing to say is I'm definitely not against models or against theories or against maths in economics or anything like that at all. All models have limitations and all models have assumptions, and as long as theirs are made explicit in terms of what they are and the limitations of that, I think that is fine. What I was mainly talking about was the sort of basic neoclassical economics framework that is taught and you're encountered. It isn't sort of presented as this is one theoretical model of an economy and an economic system. Here are the assumptions that are kind of baked within it. It's often so. Just for example, just to give one off the top of my head, how are wages set? I mean, neoclassical economics will say it's the marginal product of labour. In other words, people get paid what their marginal contribution to production is, and therefore everyone gets paid what they deserve. It's all fair. It's all based on contribution, which is empirically not remotely true at all. It ignores a whole bunch of factors that determine the balance between labour and capital. As Stephen said, notably power of various different shapes and forms, and that kind of thing is often, if you read a textbook, it's just not there. And so, it's more about recognising the limitations and a pluralist approach to recognise that there are different models for different scenarios, and there's a whole school of different schools of economics. And I was involved in a movement called Rethinking Economics, which was born out of the financial crisis because people like me were sort of studying economics in the post-crisis environment, and what we're getting taught bore no resemblance to what was happening in the world. In fact, we were getting taught something called the efficient markets hypothesis, which told us that something like the financial crisis couldn't happen because markets are always efficient. And that's really about promoting pluralism in when you get taught economics. So yes, let's learn the neoclassical stuff. Let's learn feminist economics. Let's learn ecological economics. Let's learn post-Keynesian. Let's learn Marxism. Recognize there's a pluralism here, and each have something to offer, rather than there being, one definitive truth. And finally, just to Stephen's point before, I definitely don't think neoclassical economics should be thrown in the bin and started again. I think that has useful elements to it, but I think there are limitations to it, and there are lots that can be brought from other disciplines as well. And I'll definitely look at that book that you recommended.
Stephen, I can see you nodding. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of what we do, I mean, the modelling we do is very practically based, so I mean, it's very much like, if you raise the Scottish Child payment by £20, what are the impacts of that? So we're not really using a kind of assumptions. The assumptions we do use are very realistic, I think. I mean, just in terms of economics, but it's really interesting. So my son and daughter, my son's in the final year, my daughter graduated last year, both done economics, and the way it was taught to both of them makes me absolutely despair. There's no effort to connect what they are learning to real world problems and solutions. It's so depressing when both of them went in there super enthusiastic about learning economics. My son over time's gravitated towards history, and my daughter's graduated with a good degree, but she's not really interested in using it because she was put off the subject when she was at university. So I mean, I largely agree with Laurie's criticisms of economics. I'm just nervous about, I'm not accusing Laurie of this, but I think much of the public discourse tends to divide economics into a kind of, a very kind of straitjacketed form of neoclassical economics and a kind of heroic heterodoxy, and I don't think it divides along those lines particularly well. I think, if we're going to talk about the balance of power between labour and capital, much of what I've learned has came from scholars who would probably describe themselves as neoclassical, or certainly working within the mainstream, and I think a lot of the interesting work for the last 20 years or so round about kind of inequality, the kind of institutional underpinnings and that have came from what might be described as the mainstream, whilst, yes, I mean, lots of interesting stuff coming from the more heterodox side as well. So I'm just kind of nervous that much of the public debate just tends to dismiss economics as a whole, and I kind of wonder, if we want to know what the market doesn't deliver in terms of healthcare, Kenneth Arrow does provide a pretty good explanation of that. If we want to know the consequences of, labour-intensive services, taking up an ever larger share of the economy, read Baumol, he explains that pretty well, But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nonsense in there, and yes, a lot of neoclassical economics is used for political purposes that I would regard as nefarious. So I think we're largely in agreement, but we disagreement at the margin.
Could I just say one very brief thing? Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think part of the issue is it's true that at the PhD level and beyond, people start to move beyond this stuff and lots of things that bear closer resemblance to reality. The vast majority of people who study economics never get to PhD level and beyond. They go and they do basic undergrad, maybe masters, and then go into the world and go into senior positions in government, Bank of England, and all this kind of stuff, based on the education that Stephen's children have just had. And so, yeah, I think there's the distinction between what we're teaching people at the kind of basic level, which is what most people get, as opposed to that some of the sort of more cutting edge stuff in leading scholarship, if that makes sense. So I think I largely agree with what Stephen said.
Next question. Good evening. For a future to exist, we would need families and children. At the moment, there's been a very sharp decline in birth rates. People are either too sad to have children, do not believe enough in the future to have children, or cannot afford or cannot have a timetable good enough to accommodate for children. What kind of, in 50 years, what will be the place of family and children within the capitalist system, do you think?
Big question. Alison, you didn't answer the last question, but I'm mindful I don't want to go to a woman with the first question. Laurie, you've just had 2 kids under 2. I think that's very brave. Do you want to start on this one, and then we'll go to Alison, because you mentioned children earlier?
Yeah, I mean, the decline in birth rate is really interesting, and I think, at least, it's not an expert in it, but as far as I can tell, what's driving it exactly is hard to tell, because this is a global phenomenon. I think everywhere in the world, largely outside sub-Saharan Africa, the birth rate is now below 2.1, which is the replacement rate, which means that we are going to see, although population is going to grow and grow and grow for decades longer, at the moment it will tip into reverse. And because the maths here are largely exponential, once that happens, we could see quite a sharp decline in population globally. And we hear a lot about the debate around economic growth. Is it good or is it bad? And at the moment, we're on course for degrowth over a century, whether we like it or not from that basis. So I think there are lots of things causing it. No doubt the economic side is huge. I mean, having had 2 kids, it's very expensive. I mean, the childcare stuff is, it's such a huge factor. And yes, we have some free hours in Scotland. You don't get that until you're 3. The burden of that is just enormous. I think there are other cultural factors as well, and I think there's obviously good things. More women entering the labour market in recent decades. That's probably contributed in terms of focusing on career. But I also, and this is just a hunch, I don't know this for sure, but I think the society that we're in with the internet and social media and lots of these different things, I think that we are creating an environment. I do think where the focus on having children in family seems to have kind of dissipated for whatever reason. And I don't think we should be in a situation where we're kind of like forcing people to have children or anything like that. South Korea, I think they've got the lowest birth rate in the world. They're taking some pretty stringent steps to really try and get it up. But I do think we should do much more to try and understand what is causing that. And what are the drivers, and where there are things that we can do something about, do something about it, because I do think it's something that, I don't think it's a good thing, and it's clearly something has gone wrong somewhere when we've seen such a sharp decline. But I don't think there are easy answers.
Alison?
I mean, the decline has been over a long period of time, and it's as more women in the workplace, but also more women choosing not to have children, which is a completely valid choice. I think there's a huge issue in terms of what we look around, because on its own, declining birth rate is not the problem, but it's the increasing dependency ratio, and we're now at a point where we've got fewer under 16s than we've got over 65s, and that is it's going to be more and more acute. So I think the Fiscal Commission have suggested that by around about 2049 is the real critical period where we're going to have a mass increase in over 75s, and we're going to have very, very few people. Proportionally, they're going to be able to pay for the services in and around that. So in terms of the broader economic knock-ons from that birth rate, there's things that we need to consider there. But some of the issues in and around about the choices that you make and having kids, there's an awful lot of discussion that we have about the nursery hours in Scotland, but as my kids are now in high school, but the biggest obstacle I faced was when you leave childcare, which you can pretty much find that you can get childcare that will cover you from 7 till 6 or other variations around you where you're able to work. When your kids start school, there are very few jobs where you can kind of manage 10 to 2. Wraparound is a massive problem in terms of trying to juggle that and juggle how you get your kids to school, get to primary school, get to a workplace, get back again. There's things there that there needs to be the broader conversations around about the practical inputs. I think it's one of those things where we've been really great in Scotland in recent years of bigging up certain policies but not actually looking at how they impacted on the ground. And I think there's more that we can do in terms of actually talking to those who are struggling and are wanting to access and reach certain things. There's a daft thing around about the nursery provision in Scotland where it kicks in the term after your child the term after your child turns 3. Now all kids start school at the same point in the same year, so it means that depending on when your birthday is, you'll either get 1 year of funded preschool provision or 2, which is starting things off different. It's creating an attainment gap before people have even started school. Now, either parents will be, if they're using partnership providers, will be paying additional money, but little things like that we can look at addressing. But I think there's a more of a broader national conversation about what do we want, what are we looking for, and what are the long-term impacts of that, the child issue, I think.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, as Laurie said, I think this is absolutely fascinating. I mean, birth rates have been on fertility rate been a downward trajectory in advanced nations for a long time, but in the last 10 years it's fallen off a cliff, but also in developing nations as well, so this is completely unprecedented. Alice Evans at the LSE, who are always reading this kind of thing, Lazy Blame family on smartphones, done a lot of work around about this, but when people are essentially amusing themselves on the phone, they've got very little incentive to be developing relationships, and the correlation does seem to be pretty tight. I think the kind of bad news is, the record of pronatal policies is really poor. It's really difficult to identify a pronatal policy that's worked anywhere. I think Hungary's get closest, with policies none of us might be particularly comfortable with, but even there it hardly budged things. And just final point, slightly more optimistic on the dependency ratio. I think we need to be very careful about this. So the old age dependency ratio has gone up, but the number of children falling in knowledge dependency ratio is remaining roughly the same. Adair Turner had a good paper out recently, really kind of quite optimistic about this. People are healthier, life expectancy has grown as well, so we're living longer, but we're living healthier as well. Not everybody, it's again the distribution, and that's quite skewed. But people are working longer because they want to work longer in a lot of cases. So I think some of the really pessimistic narratives you hear around about some of this stuff, I don't think really stand up.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I've worked for 10 years or so at an institute of UCL, the Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security, and our work came to an end really last summer, and I've been interrupted in the last 3 months by cancer and recovering from that, and it concentrates the mind on the services that we actually receive. What I was asked to do was literally to think the unthinkable from the background of many years in global markets, and of course the fact we came 2 hours away from the cash machines being switched off. And the expression which really resonates most with me is the expression ways and means. The ways and means is an account at the Bank of England, okay? And it's actually been supplanted by the Debt Management Office. But ways and means are institutions and instruments. And what institutions and instruments can we use to actually to actually implement the policies that we need, okay? That's what I've been pondering this. Not me, others as well. And there's some very, very simple answers. 1 or 2 have been actually illustrated tonight. I'll give you 2. One personally experienced. One is, I call it a care for equity swap. There's no reason at all why people's work cannot be monetized literally by prepayment, by credits, call them care credits, if you will. What's on the other side of that? Well, rental credits. It's not rocket science. My boys are land rich but care poor. And then I'm care poor but land rich technically. Now, can we not make the institutions and instruments to actually make that happen? Yes, we can. But banks can't print care, okay? But people essentially can. So that's one thing. The second was thanks to Robbie and his mention of James Watt. Because I was a director of a global energy exchange, and I've got a lot to say about energy and what's going on in the world. But he mentioned James Watt. James Watt, anybody here know what his business model was? He didn't sell his new pumps to the Cornish tin mines. He gave them the use of them, pumping as a service, in exchange for 1/3 of the coal they saved. And he made out like a bandit, we heard. But why? Because his pump was 500% more efficient than the previous one. There is colossal, the biggest trade of the 21st century, in my view, will be the smart swap. That's what James Watt did. Shared savings. What's the problem with the ways and means? Shareholders don't share. Lenders don't share. Contracts for difference, and I used to design them for a living, don't share. So what we need is partnership means, ways and means, and instruments. Very simple. Prepayment at a discount has been around for centuries. It's called stock. It's where rate of return, the expression, comes from. These are all things that I've learnt and I could bore you all night with. But I'm saying that the future is there in the past. There's nothing that, there is no need for any change in law. None. Mutual agreements are all we need to actually have what somebody I heard just the other night say, a low carbon enlightenment. Because by God, it's possible. Sorry, bit of a preach there.
We managed to clear the room of one person, but I'm imagining he's running for a train. That was more of a comment than a question. Does anyone on the panel have any reflections before I go to the next question?
It's great to see you here, Chris.
Come back to you now.
Thanks. Can I get back to basics? I suppose Smith's big insight in economics was this concept of the invisible hand. And I suppose our future is really based on our ability as a species, as a society, to innovate. And I suppose my concern is that if you don't have the invisible hand innovating, and that boils down to individual people, betting the ranch, betting the house, betting their families' economic well-being on managing to identify things that could be done better, niches to fill, is that more likely to benefit society in terms of innovation than the sort of a very risk-averse bureaucrat who's supposed to, come up with innovations in the Ministry of Innovation? And I'm sceptical about that. If we're talking, recommending books, there's a fantastic book by a chap called Eric Beenhocker, Complexity Economics, which actually goes into that whole issue. It also, as our speaker said, it blows the whole, it blows apart classic economics and their physics envy. But my concern is that we're banking on bureaucracy having the answers. It was bureaucracy that decided that we should pay care home operators below cost to run care homes. And they told local authorities at the same time, get out of that, guys, it's going to be a loss maker. Local authorities have stepped aside. The health service have stepped aside from care homes. Private care operators, some of which are charities, were left to pick up the pieces. I yesterday passed what was a very large Salvation Army care home with a very good reputation in Collington Road. That is now demolished, because not having any private paying people to cross-subsidise the state-funded people, it was a loss maker, and the charities simply couldn't decide it. So I think it's dangerous to rely on bureaucrats to supplant the invisible hand, not least because we are not a closed system. Scotland, and indeed the UK, is not a hermetically sealed kingdom, and if it comes to the point that people don't like the fact that bureaucrats have decided they know better than individuals, than the invisible hand, and people will simply up and off. And sadly, it will be the ones with most get up and go who actually do get up and go. So I think I'd be quite interested to know that whether do you think Smith was wrong? Was Smith wrong in thinking the invisible hand was actually something quite useful?
Let's go first.
Just on your point about the bureaucrats on that side, I would agree with you that I think there's numerous examples that we have where the bureaucrats aren't the ones that they are stifling innovation, whereas we need a system that encourages it. And you just need to look at something like the NHS app that we don't have in Scotland, that has been around for many, many years down south, but because we try and create it in-house, we know best. And by some point next year, some people in South Lanarkshire might be able to do something around about dermatology, but we've got people that are able to do and adapt and learn from things because we're willing to work with the others and where the innovators are. I think there is a danger of relying on everything being done in-house, whereas we should be trying to create the environment that encourages the innovation, that encourages that entrepreneurial spirit.
Could I just say briefly that, to be clear, I have absolutely no problem at all in bureaucrats playing a regulatory role. It's absolutely necessary. And I think the problem we've had is that people who've been fantastic innovators have suddenly seamlessly segued into being rent seekers. And the big tech companies are the attitude. And Theodore Roosevelt must be turning in his grave at Trump's attitude towards these people.
I think on the regulatory point, if I just pick up on that one, I think we saw this week the importance of regulation. The fire in Glasgow seems to have started in a vape shop, that although there was regulation, there was no enforcement. And without enforcement, the regulations are meaningless. And so I think all the stuff that's beginning to come out without that is beginning to put a bit of question in and around about how we properly regulate and enforce, because I think there has been a danger where we kind of legislate and forget, or regulate and forget, and I think that beginning of a discussion that's important is we're hopefully going to have.
Next question.
Hello. We heard at the beginning that, quite rightly, Adam Smith wouldn't recognise what we now call capitalism. There was a comment last night made that I think it's £40 billion worth of GDP in the US is then supplanted or has superimposed upon it 400 billion of people who buy and sell shares, bankers, etc., etc. Adam Smith actually described, he was himself an academic, he described them as non-productive. That means that the American economy actually consists of more non-productive people now than productive people. Adam Smith wouldn't have recognised it. Now, there is another sector developing, and it's called community business. People tend to discount it. It's all about charity shops and things like that. No, it's not. We already have a community distillery in Scotland, and what distinguishes them is the non-distribution of the money they make. What distinguishes them is the fact that being set in a community, they cannot be taken over. The whole mergers and acquisitions business, and I hesitate to say this, but there could be a few people in this room that depend on it, is gone because the shares are sold at face value. There's no trading involved. That's the kind of business model that I think Adam Smith would recognise. I wonder if the panel thinks that that might be the future of 50 years hence.
Thanks. Who wants to take that?
Yeah, good question. So really we're talking about types of enterprise here, and I think this is exactly right. And I think in my remarks I'd said that we need to look at the firm and firm ownership and governance. And the reality is that when people think about business or corporations, they're thinking of the kind of shareholder-owned PLC that's on the stock exchange. I think that's kind of the default. That's one of many forms that a firm can take. And I think there are lots of issues with that particular model that are partly contributing to some of the issues with capitalism that we see in terms of short-termism, in terms of prioritising shareholder value over other things. The reality is there's a whole range of plural business models, including community ownership, which I think in Scotland, I think there's clear evidence that community ownership's delivered actually very strong returns, not just economic, but economic, social, environmental returns, whether that's community-owned land or community-owned businesses. There's cooperatives, there's mutuals, there's platform co-ops. There's a whole range of different ownership models, and I think that Scotland has started to talk about trying to scale up different plural ownership models, and I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. I think there are different options for different circumstances, but I do think thinking about how we can scale up some of those more democratically owned enterprises, just something we should be thinking about, because in terms of employee ownership, for example, there's a lot of evidence to say that employee-owned firms like co-ops, not only are they delivering better outcomes for workers in terms of higher wages, higher well-being, the profits are shared with the staff, they're actually more productive than shareholder-owned competitors, which makes sense because if you're a worker there and you've got a stake in the company, you're probably going to work harder than if you're just getting paid a wage. And so, yeah, how we can scale up different, more democratic forms of enterprise, I think is really important, including community ownership, and that's something that we're working with the Scottish Government at the moment to try and get them to do as part of the broader community wealth building agenda.
Can I just say something briefly on that? As well as the sort of the scale up, I think there's a growth in scale deep, and in those kind of community-based social enterprises that are kind of looking to that kind of longer term. I think there has been too much focus, perhaps in the Scottish Government, for all colours, looking for the sort of the unicorns. And what we've seen recently with Brewdog, which was a unicorn which has fallen apart, that we need to be actually scaling deep, having these big roots in communities and doing exactly what you're saying, because that is the longevity. That's encouraging sustainable, long-term growth in communities, and that's what we need to see more of.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the fascinating presentations. And I actually have a question, and I'm curious how you think we fund the policies that you mentioned, so the childcare and the social care, the 4-day working week, And I'm curious whether you're advocating for higher taxes or the growth agenda that the Chancellor is supporting, or is it modern monetary theory or redistribution from other policies? What's your take on it?
So a couple of different ones. The first one on social care, we advocate in line for social insurance. There needs to be more money in investment, and the funding has to come from somewhere. It can't come from where the money is at the moment. So looking at a sort of social insurance model of the sort that are used elsewhere in Europe in terms of funding social care, because money has to come from somewhere. In terms of some of the broader issues around about funding, we need to look seriously about what we are able to afford. I think if you look at the manifestos from different organisations as we go into the election, every organisation is calling for more investment in something. We cannot afford everything, and we need to make some difficult choices. And that's why we are asking for there to be more of a consideration and look across what are our priorities, what is it we want to be spending money on. There are an awful lot of things, whether they are the sort of the free eye test but long queues to get glaucoma or cataract operations, the free bus travel that I mentioned, but we've got places in rural Scotland where there are no buses. We need to look at what is the most effective way that we can deliver outcomes. So we would review some of those spending options. So we've going to be publishing a manifesto that goes into that, but everything has to be costed because there is a limit on the resource. And so certainly that's how we would fund the social care, though, is through social insurance.
Laurie?
Yeah, just very briefly. So we actually just published last week or the week before a paper called Funding Scotland's Future, which is trying to answer the question, how do we pay for it? And so this is looking at the devolved context in Scotland, setting out with modelling to back it up a whole range of different tax reforms, including income tax, replacing council tax with a proper functioning property tax, replacing non-domestic rates with a land value tax, introducing a frequent flyer tax. So we've set out certainly our view on how we can do that in the devolved context in Scotland. But I think there is a question that we need to ask as a society, which is what kind of country do we want to be? Because if we want to maintain or even extend the kind of social contract that we've got, and in terms of what we expect the state to deliver, I do think both at the Scottish and the UK level, taxes will need to go up if we want to not only maintain the social contract, but deliver on the kinds of objectives that certainly the Scottish Government has set out. I don't think there's any way that we can escape that. But there's also other things we can do. But I think the tax point is absolutely critical and we can't escape it. At the UK level, it's obviously slightly different. I think taxes need to go up there as well. But I think there's other aspects to fiscal and monetary policy at the UK level, which at the devolved level we don't have access to.
Yeah, I think Scottish politics is just fundamentally unserious on these matters. At the moment we've got a First Minister who has 4 key priorities, the first of which is eradicating child poverty, so not just reducing child poverty, but eradicating it. We know what really makes a difference there is cash transfers to families with children. So if you wanted to eradicate child poverty, it would just be extremely expensive. So the idea that you can do that and not raise taxes is just ludicrous, and it should be treated as such. But also listened to Anis Samar, leader of the Scottish Labour Party, give his conference speech a couple of weeks ago. He'd been speaking in the recent past about reducing taxes, and then delivered a conference speech that implied raising taxes in multiple dimensions. So it's really unserious. I think this is where Laurie's report last week was really good. We also need to recognise if we want to live in that kind of Scotland, we want to fund these things, we're all going to have to pay for it. And the UK is now a bit of an outlier, although our kind of total tax revenues are now kind of middle to kind of slightly higher in terms of the OECD. The proportion paid by lower and middle earners is significantly lower than other countries. The Scottish Government's own tax fact sheets show that the kind of bottom decile of taxpayers pay roughly the same as the rest of the UK and the Benelux countries. In Nordic and Benelux countries, the higher rate taxpayers pay a wee bit more, but not that much more. But the median taxpayer pays way less. So that's just, again, it's fundamentally unserious. If you want people to buy into your policy agenda, then you really should be honest about what that means in terms of tax revenues. They have to go up.
Wow, what a way to end. We've got a couple of minutes. I want to say a few things that have occurred to me across the 3 nights, because there have been really similar themes. I always, that question people ask you, if you could have dinner with anyone, who would it be? I recently watched the Channel 4 documentary Dirty Business, all about the water industry, and I think I would have loved to have watched that with Adam Smith and talk to him about all the ethics and the morals and the capital flows in that. And I just think there's so much we can learn from looking back at what he said, but applying it to our circumstances today. But we also need to recognise that our economy is changing, and it's changing fast. We've had questions every night this week, I think, on AI. But one of the things that came up last night was the biggest retailer in the UK is now Vinted, selling second-hand clothes. And I think that idea of the circular economy is coming very quickly. And I don't think our high streets or our economy is talking about it. People are talking about save the high street. Whatever the high street emerges into in future will be very different from what it is now. We can already see footfall at charity shops going down because of Vinted and because of the lack of donations. So things are changing really quickly, but they can also change when policies change. So Finland had a policy of eradicating homelessness. In 2022, they were down to 112 families in the whole of Finland. The government changed in 2023, and a lot of the policies were changed and the support was changed. The homelessness in Finland is now rising rapidly in a way that they never thought they would see. And so I think we need to think about those questions when we're talking about changing one thing. We might end up with something else. So just thinking really deeply about all the things we're talking about tonight and the way that Adam Smith would, and take that and learn so that we can all learn from each other, because I don't think there are any simple answers here. And I can see Robbie itching to get the microphone off me. So I'll say thank you very much to all of you. Robbie will do the final clap, so I'll leave it to him to save time.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Susan, and thank you to all of you as well, and indeed to the audience for these interesting and engaging questions. I just want to suggest one thing, and perhaps I will also make one or two comments first, though. Thinking of Adam Smith and reading Wealth of Nations again, the phrase which has jumped out at me this time is the idea of the progress of opulence. Now, I did mention this on Monday, so I won't bore you by saying the same thing, Susan, but I remember when the Scottish Parliament was established, I thought, well, the real measure of success will be if we start to see migration back towards Scotland, if people want to come and live here. And we did have one question which was about the long-term demography of the world, and why is it that there's virtually no country now, possibly even within Africa, there's virtually no country in which fertility is at a sustainable level. And for Adam Smith, I'm quite certain that he would be thinking about what does that mean about opulence? Because an opulent society for Adam Smith was one which was high growth, in which there would be high wealth, and in high wages, and in which, anticipating Malthus's analysis, there would also be increasing population. So somewhere along this line, we've managed globally to mislead opulence. And there perhaps is a challenge for economy, which I'll distinguish from economics very carefully, economy being the practices that support our economic behaviour, and economics as being the study of what the effects of our economic behaviour is. Now, we have had a wonderful week here. We don't want to stop at this point. And particularly in June, there will be quite a lot of events in Scotland around about, because Adam Smith's birthday was probably the 5th of June. We're not absolutely certain. And so what you will find on more or less every level surface around the library will be sheets like this. We're taking the Enlightenment approach, which is that traditionally the questions which were subjected to debate didn't come from some wise committee of wise elders, but came from the members of the community. The view was very much that if Scotland was to change, everyone had to be involved. Anyone who had an interesting opinion could take part in the debate. And I hope that we've managed to capture something of that. But what we want to do is, rather than just go away and come back in June with ideas that we think that are important, to come back and talk about the ideas which people who've been in the audience, who have been participants in this conversation so far this week, think are important. So if you've got time, please do fill out one of these forms, hand it to myself or indeed to my colleagues. I'm looking for Yes, Lauren is at the back. Hand it to one of us, and we'll try and make certain that we're able to discuss something, and it will be something which is of interest not just to us but to the wider community in the Library of Mistakes. Thank you very much for coming. I'd like to thank and I'd like to think that you could perhaps put your hands together once more for our panel, who have been absolutely stunning this evening. Okay, so we're finished. Can I just say one thing before you go and enjoy your drinks? Once you have enjoyed your drinks, could you take your glasses to the back